Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything, Coast to Coast, with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire. And we have our other erstwhile hosts here tonight, including Jonathan Schwartz and, of course, the eponymous, can I use that term for you, Evan Ginsberg, the eponymous Evan Ginsberg. Obviously, I feel bad about putting our audience through two shows where we already had a memorial for Tony Jones, and I'll be going to his funeral this week, actually, over in the South Bay. But unfortunately, two other people passed that were important to both Evan and Mike. Do you want to talk about that to start the show?
Sure. I could even read something very quickly. I wrote a piece for Pro Wrestling Post. It's going to run this week. And I said in the past 30 days, we lost Tony Jones and also two other, friends of mine, Hector Boza, who was a public access host who did a wrestling show and also an arts program. He had two different shows. And Dr. Tom Parks out of Arizona, who was a wrestler, a manager. Let me just quickly read this. It's very short. 57-year-old Hector Boza passed away on May 3rd, a talk show host. He was a true champion of independent wrestling. Staten Island, New York-based Boza produced public access shows, Independent Wrestling Highlights, since 2010, and the Home Invaders show since 2007. Both regularly featured East Coast indie wrestlers. Hector even had a YouTube channel supporting the indies. It's called Wrestling Highlights, if anybody wants to check it out. An actor and colorful character in his own right, Hector was also a beloved member of the arts community. Rosanna Robertson, who worked with him on his various programs, described Hector as, quote, someone who would help anyone that needed it, no matter how great or small that need was. He made us laugh, his charm was infectious, and he never gave up on people or himself. He saved my life and made me reach goals and have experiences I never imagined I'd live to see happen in my life. Robertson continued in her praise for Hector. He survived Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I was blessed to be there for him. His friends prayed for and visited him, and he made it through. Although it was the first of many maladies that he suffered through due to 9/11, it wasn't those illnesses that directly took him from us. It was the resulting trauma from a car accident that took almost 6 weeks to cause him to leave us all behind. He was always a fighter with a big heart and soul, but this was a battle he was destined to lose. Hector's last wish was to be buried with his grandparents. If anybody would be kind enough to help, there's a GoFundMe for Hector Boza, B-O-S-A. And also very brief, indie wrestler, manager, and wrestling historian, Dr. Tom Parks, age 56, lost his battle after a stroke. An eclectic, intelligent, caring human being who loved pro wrestling. Our mutual friend Dale Pierce, who is also gone, wrote the following about him years ago. Dr. Tom Parks was born Tim Hicks in Virginia, and it is his real Hicks name he has gone back to using as he has left wrestling, except for contact with wrestlers at his church or old-time reunions. He has instead been devoting time to political and religious issues and book publishing. Hicks became involved with wrestling by publishing a news sheet, then started to work as a photographer, and finally adapting to the new Parks name, became a referee and occasional wrestler. In the early 1900s, he moved to Arizona, where he saw action as a photographer. R.C. Preston and other promoters eventually roped him into referee work for Phoenix area shows. In the late 90s, he became a manager again under the Tom Parks name and generated great heat from the crowd during his run. Hicks/Parks also founded the popular Arizona Wrestling Legends website and was involved with the Arizona old-timer reunions, along with the late cowboy Bob Yuma. And what can I say? Three people that I knew to varying degrees, respected, all in their 50s. Tony Jones, Tom Parks, Hector Boza. And let me just say this, and it's totally fitting because Jonathan is here. Slam Wrestling is one of the few sites that acknowledge guys like this. Much respect to Slam Wrestling. Slam Wrestling had a very, detailed article on Tony Jones, and this requires work and research and interviewing people, and it requires effort. And it's a bit much. The 5,000th report on Raw, SmackDown, Collision, all 3 AEW shows, every angle, every match, overanalyzed ad nauseum.
But you're going to forget about next day anyway. You're going to forget about whatever happened on last week. Can anyone remember what the hell happened 3 shows ago? Whatever it was. Pay-per-view, an AEW, dark, the midnight matches or lightning or whatever, shows that they have. You're not going to remember it. But these people work their whole lives to, accomplish something, especially when it's indie guys like a Tony Jones or like Bosa or
Tom Parks.
Yeah, Tom Parks. They never make the big highlights. They're never ones that are, on the front of anybody's minds, and yet, they devoted their whole lives.
Tom Parks had a similar career to Tony. Tom Parks did some jobs for the old NWA back in the 80s and 90s, from what Dale Pierce had told me. And he just never made the quote-unquote big time, but he devoted his life to pro wrestling. So, to take 5 minutes out of a podcast or for somebody to write a short piece on these guys, Slam Wrestling does it, Pro Wrestling Post does it, very few others do it. Meltzer, will, depending on the person, he's known for his obits, but generally with indie guys, it's just a couple of brief sentences. It's not a detailed piece. And, acknowledge these guys. I mean,
Jonathan, your thoughts?
No, I agree. Of the 3 gentlemen you named, I'm most familiar with Tony Jones. He was one of those guys who was always kind of featured in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, and across a lot of the wrestling magazines. And as the internet was kind of growing as a means for people to be fans of wrestling, he was one of those names that would often kind of show up. He was a big guy. He was a very, very good wrestler in ring from what I was able to catch. And he did work the occasional shot for WCW, and I think he had a few matches as enhancement talent for WWF as well at the time. And he was always...
The shortest match I ever saw live was him versus Snitsky. That was the shortest match he ever had.
What a shame. What a shame.
It was a shame.
And again, he was one of those guys who always seemed better than the opportunities that came his way. He's one of those guys who, if you saw him, you kind of wondered why he never quite caught on the way that some other talent might. There's lots of guys like that. I know Buddy was really close friends with Bison Smith, for example. And here's a guy who was big and had the size and had the look and had the charisma and had the in-ring ability, and actually worked a pretty impressive stint with Ring of Honor, had worked extensively with All Japan, I think it was as well.
And Puerto Rico. He was a huge star.
And he was one of those guys who you were just kind of always waiting to see him make that next move. And for whatever reason, fate just had something else in store for him.
Jonathan,
I think there's a lot of guys like that along the way.
Yeah, speaking of that, my dear friend Tiger Khan, who's also gone, he worked for the Hearts. So, you're out there for 10 years. You finally get your WWE tryout. He's in a tag match, quote unquote dark match at the Meadowlands. And he said to me, the guys he worked with just choked. They choked. It was not a particularly good match. So you get that 1 or 2 shots, and these guys realize they've put thousands and thousands of hours and miles into it. This is this is the moment, and you can't wrestle a match by yourself. So,
it's one thing that strikes me often, just given the kind of stories that we often cover here, that there are so many people who absolutely love and give their hearts and their bodies and their careers and decades of their lives to pro wrestling, and it just never quite loves them back the same way. And if you're lucky and you have that kind of longer career, maybe you make a name for yourself regionally, you get involved in training, you're well liked and well respected around the community. You have that kind of group of people who support you, people like us, for example, and you make whatever living you do off of that, or you do it as a side hustle and keep whatever shoot job you actually have. And I think for a lot of people, and I think that there's, examples of people who did kind of make it to an extent, like the George Souths and the Bob Cooks and, all kinds of people who have those kind of brief enhancement runs across different companies. And hopefully at the end, they still kind of feel that they have something to show for it. And I think for a lot of people, that's hopefully good enough, and that's something that they can hold their heads up with. And then there's people who just never quite make it, and it turns into something negative for them. I mean, there's an awful lot of stories like that, even for people who do kind of, make it to a high profile. I mean, if you've got your 350 days hat on, I mean, we've all seen enough shoot interviews with Superstar Graham, for example, who gave everything he had, and for the kind of talent that he was, the kind of run that he had, really should have been, one would hope, a much happier and more fulfilled person based on what he accomplished professionally. And depending on the mood you caught him in, sometimes you caught that side of him, and sometimes you saw somebody who was ultimately, it seems, really disheartened and dissatisfied by a combination of the choices that he made in and outside the ring and the way the business treated him.
Let me interject something on, while we're having this discussion. This is the kind of thing that, I really love about this show, is that we talk about things that are much deeper than just, the results of matches. And we talk about the psychology of what makes wrestling different and the people that are involved different. And one thing that I think about when I think about indie wrestling, as opposed to, let's say, other sports like football or basketball or baseball kind of thing, there's a certain cutoff that you get in football and baseball and basketball where they, the organizations make it very clear that you don't have a future with them, and that you'll never, amount to anything if after you're in your 20s you're not picked up by a minor league team of some type, And when you're 30 years old, you're done. I mean, there's no way that you're ever going to make a major pro team if you haven't already made it in your 30s. But in indie pro wrestling, there's always a spot for everyone somewhere. And so that hope, whether it's positive or negative, to encourage people to stay with it, is still there. No matter where you are and no matter what stage you are in wrestling, whether you're good or bad, there's an indie card somewhere that'll take you. And so I think for some people, that dream won't leave them because they're always able to somehow perform, even though they're, wrestling in front of, 40 people, for a hot dog and handshake, and the hot dog's half eaten, and the handshake is more like this as soon as you try to reach for it, but they'll still do it because they can.
But the exception proves the rule.
Yeah.
So for everybody who's trying desperately to make something stick well beyond what you or I might think of as one's athletic prime, you've got somebody like LA Knight, who finally cracks the main roster and gets over with the audience at 41 years old.
Yeah, Diamond Dallas Page is the other one I was thinking of too.
DDP, Batista only started wrestling in his 30s, well into his 30s. And even then you've got guys, I think even more rare, who, AJ Styles just main evented a pay-per-view at almost 47. I wrote about this in my last piece for Slam Wrestling. probably the three hottest acts in AEW right now are Adam Copeland and Christian Cage, who are both 50, and Chris Jericho, who's 53. And I don't think Jericho's in-ring is necessarily as much fun to watch, say, as Copeland and Christian Cage, but they're putting on absolute crazy matches. And Jericho, for the umpteenth time, has been able to reinvent himself into a character that people love to hate. But again, the other side of the coin is you've got somebody like Ric Flair, who in his 50s was still compelling to watch, but certainly in his 70s, I'm kind of ready to see him off my TV screen. And I think any number of medical professionals would probably agree with that.
But his bill collectors don't want him to leave the screen, so I'm sure they're all happy to see Ric Flair show back up anytime. You know, all his divorce, all his alimony and divorce attorneys, you know, probably are pretty happy to see him still wrestle. But what are your thoughts, Evan?
When Ric Flair came back in that comeback match where he supposedly had a heart attack or whatnot, it was a pitiful spectacle. It was requiem for a heavyweight. It was a money grab. It was just sad. You're sitting there hoping one of your all-time favorites literally doesn't die. It's anti-entertainment, and I think it's disgraceful to put somebody in the ring where he's seriously at risk.
What about Sting? Risk. What about Sting in his final match that just happened?
Oh, I mean, that was crazy. Sting is much younger than Flair and in far better shape, and he doesn't have a history of, near fatal,
yeah, but he was diving through broken glass and smashing himself into tables anyway, for a final match. It wasn't exactly, scientific affair or anything like that.
Yeah, but he'll have a long period to recuperate, and he made very good money for that last run on a limited schedule. So I kind of understand what Sting did, but Flair's thing was just a sad thing to watch. And I don't like ageism. I don't think a door should be shut because somebody's 30, 35, 40 or whatnot. And, if you have the ability and the drive, I don't think that's even legal, let alone fair. These are corporations, major publicly traded corporations. So to say we're not going to hire somebody because they're 40, I don't even think they could do that. But obviously, it's the exception to the rule when an older wrestler finally makes it. Ironically, I'm not all that impressed with LA Knight. He's had 2 pay-per-view main events, both of which were good, very good, neither great. And he's yet to have a great match there. To me, it's all sizzle and no steak, but he certainly has the look and the charisma. The matches themselves just haven't really done much.
I think that's more towards booking, though, than it is the actual talent itself.
I enjoyed him much more in TNA. I just don't think his matches have been that wonderful.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Jonathan.
So I actually wanted to put something to both of you, which is, so Sting was a good example. I'll throw Bill Goldberg in there as well. That they have these latter-day runs where they're either booked as world beaters or the champions that they always were. Maybe it's just me, but I'm kind of also thinking outside of wrestling and into other kinds of performance as well, whether there's something to be said for walking away and leaving the audience wanting more. So, I think about somebody like Michael Jordan would be probably my favorite example, where he had that first three-peat with the Chicago Bulls, retired arguably very early, partly motivated by the death of his father, and decided to take a crack at playing baseball with the Chicago White Sox. Comes back after a couple of years to another run of 3 straight championships, retires again, This time it feels a little bit more satisfying. He's an older player. You can see that he's not quite putting up the same numbers, although he's still Michael Jordan. Goes away for a little while again. And then partly because he's looking for a management stake in another NBA team, he resurfaces with the then Washington Wizards. And again, on any given night, he could be the Michael Jordan that everybody remembers. But a lot of people kind of see that as a bit of a footnote to an otherwise brilliant career. Magic Johnson did the same thing. Larry Bird stayed retired, but I think you see it in a lot of cases where it's hard for people to walk away and stay away.
Well, you have Mike Tyson wanting to get in the ring, coming up this summer. I think he's going to be boxing, right?
Yeah, and he's going to make crazy money, and he may just win. So there's that.
He's fighting a YouTube guy. He's fighting Logan Paul's brother, I think.
I'd be concerned for Paul more than Tyson, honestly. Yeah. I think Tyson, it's just going to kick right back in, and he's going to corner the guy, and it's going to be dangerous for the young guy. I think that's the irony of this.
Mike Tyson could be 100 years old, and I'm not going near him.
Mm.
He's one. I think he's one of the few people who, no matter what shape he's in, no matter how old he may be, just legitimately one of the most dangerous people on the planet. I totally buy that hype.
So let me tell you guys something. I just went to a concert a couple of weeks ago. I saw Bobby Rush, who's 90 years old, opening for Buddy Guy, who's 87 years old. Okay, wow. So that's 177 years between the two acts, and it was a wonderful show. And yeah, I sat there as a huge fan of these guys, and I said to myself, Buddy Guy at 47 was better than at 87, but I was still happy to see him because he's still great, and he's still putting on a show, and he still comes out with killer musicians. And what's the alternative? Not seeing the guy, So yeah, if somebody's totally washed up and has no voice and just can't do it anymore, that's a different story. But I love these guys with all my heart. So,
but in pro wrestling, it's different because you're having guys. It's one thing to be playing guitar; it's another thing to having a steel chair smashed over your head repeatedly. There's the physicality of what it requires to get in the ring and to see, people that you just know are just basically too old to take that kind of punishment. I mean, we saw, Kevin Nash, destroy his knee just by running across the ring. There's some of these guys that the actual ring itself becomes a finishing move, as opposed to anything else that is going on in the ring. And I also think back of when the NBA used to do a Legends game. I don't know if you guys remember that during the All-Star game. They used to have they used to invite older players back, have them play against each other in a Legends game. And I remember watching George Gervin go up for his finger roll, and he landed wrong on his knee and completely destroyed his knee, like in front of everybody. And it was a sad thing. It turned something that was supposed to be, a celebration of these guys and their older careers to like, okay, this is too old. They're too old to be playing, full court basketball any longer. And so, I guess it's a long way to ask the question, when is someone too old to get in the ring? Because obviously, Mil Mascaras still wants to wrestle, every so often. And as you said, Ric Flair. And are we going to draw a line and say, look, when you're over 60 years old, you really shouldn't get. I mean, I'm sure Vince McMahon is somehow penciling himself in to main event the next WrestleMania. I'm sure he's trying to find a way.
Vince McMahon wound up working a match at the last WrestleMania, and it was no less an embarrassment. Mind you, I think Vince McMahon in the ring at any point in his career was at least a little bit of an embarrassment. But the example that I always come back to is Lou Thesz's last match took place in Japan against Masahiro Chono, who was positioned as one of Thesz's proteges. And you had Thesz, who was well into his 70s, and with utmost respect to Thesz, who was one of the best wrestlers ever, a 70-year-old man who doesn't look the part anymore going up against, one of the current best wrestlers and throwing, European uppercuts with more daylight in them than would phase Dracula isn't going to me, it kind of takes away a little bit from his legacy. The whole idea of behind pro wrestling is you're working with your opponent to make it look credible so that the audience can suspend their disbelief. And I know, for example, Evan talks a lot about the really great matches and wanting to see really great matches. And part, at least I would submit, of what makes a really great match is that it puts that little bit of doubt, like Johnny Valentine used to say, that I can't make you believe pro wrestling is real, but I sure as hell can make you believe I am. And when you have people who kind of devote their whole career to walking that really thin line and making stuff believable and getting to a point where they're just kind of out there and it's just not, I find, it's, again, I would prefer.
And when you're legitimately worried about the fate of
Dory
the
Funk did the same thing. Dory Funk, towards the end of his career, worked almost exclusively with his own Ocala, Florida promotion. And again, same kind of thing. You could see him working matches and, same shots that, wouldn't crumple paper. And, this is a guy who made his living, was NWA champion for something like 4 years, and arguably one of the best workers of all time. And if you can't kind of stick to any standard, and I get things change as you get older. I mean, Flair basically from the time he was in his late 40s had gone from being a really solid technical wrestler with all the suplexes and holds because he'd had a number of shoulder issues to chopping and wooing and figure fours and flopping, and managed to basically get another 20 to 30 years of credible action out of that. So I get that at points you need to evolve your act a bit, but there just kind of comes a point where, between that and the fact that wrestling personas are so outsized, I think the audience can just move on as well. I think that would have happened with Flair. I certainly think that happened with Jerry Lawler as well, where the kind of shtick that he relied on well into the 1990s was just horribly out of place when they trot him back out in the 2020s. And we see that he recently his contract was recently not renewed except for his Legends deal.
Jerry Lawler at 75 should not be in the ring. And I saw Mil Mascaras in his 70s on an indie, and they made a real big deal that, you're going to get a rare, area appearance outside of Mexico of Mil Mascaras. And, part of you is, hey, it's great to see Mil, but the other part of you is he's a shell of what he was. And basically it's an appearance. It's not even a match because the young guys are just selling everything he does like they're being hit by a truck, and it's far from any kind of great match. He comes in, he does his 3, 4, 5 minutes, and his signature spots, and it was like in the end when Jimmy Snuka was jumping off the middle rope, and it's age and time always win. They win.
But my question is it the fault of the indies or is it the fault of the wrestlers? Or is it kind of both? I mean,
it's the fault of the promoters who did not give these guys pensions, 401ks, health benefits where they need to keep working, or Lawler made good money. Sometimes it's just you need to feel like a star, and you need to be the center of attention, and you don't know when to quit. So it's a combination.
Have some responsibility into saying, what, we're not going to run cards that trot guys out there that are just names that were big names in the 80s, but they are obviously too old, and it's not safe for them to get in there and do what they're doing right now.
Or you come in like Ricky Morton with his son, and you come in and you do your spots, and you don't embarrass yourself, and you have somebody to play off of, and you get you rest in between your spots. Ricky Morton, I don't think is embarrassing himself at this point. It depends on who it is. And Ric Flair in that last match, he was in the ring with 3 top-notch guys. He should have just wooed and chopped and been in and out and made the fans happy, cut a promo. He made the mistake of wrestling a long match that could have killed him. That was the mistake.
Jonathan, your thought?
I won't say fault, but I will say responsibility. I think part of that rests with the potential audience as well. Flair doesn't come back for that match if there isn't the perception that people are going to pay money to see him.
Top money.
So, and from what I recall, that event actually didn't do terribly. And a lot of the people who expressed interest in watching it, there was an awful lot of morbid curiosity that fueled it. I mean, there are people who spent their money to go see it live or to watch it on pay-per-view because they thought there was a chance that Flair was going to come out of it badly. Flair himself has said that he would be happy to die in the ring, which is disturbing. Even more disturbing.
Very disturbing.
Even more disturbing is the fact that his son-in-law seemed willing to bankroll that.
When I'm teaching, not wrestling, actually teaching, I don't want to die in front of a class and traumatize the students. That's insane. That's already crossing a line into insanity.
And Mark Smith, my friend Mark, was in the ring when Misawa died. And that was a horrible thing where he took the suplex and just it cut off a nerve ending that controlled his brain and his breathing, and he died right there in the ring from a heart attack, from a bump he took after, he's taken that same bump a trillion other times and not had it. So I think you got to be careful what you wish for, because it's very easy to let something like that happen. But, I'm just wondering, should there be some kind of limit, on actual age? I'm not saying cutting someone off when they're 40, but should we cut people off when they're 70? I mean, I can't think myself of ever getting in the ring and doing any bumps again. But that's after, I've broken my hip and 2 shoulders. So, it's the thought, and none of those were ring based. Those were, things that just happened to be around the house. So
I think it's based on the wrestler and his health. And what's his name, Daddy Ass over there with the Acclaimed. He's in tremendous shape and he's 60-ish. And I don't see why you would have to force him to leave. He's doing 6-mans where he's not in there the whole time, like I was saying. And I think he's perfectly qualified to do what he's doing. What do you think, Jonathan?
I think this is one of those places where having athletic commissions that have teeth and requiring medical sign-off before somebody gets to the ring. I agree that it's more of a case-by-case basis. And the other thing is, just because you're putting somebody who's 70 years old into the ring doesn't mean they have to walk around and go and take bumps and spill over the top rope and, dive into broken glass. I think that there's a way to use people in these situations in a way that doesn't pose a risk. And I think that there's an obligation on promoters and on whatever the local athletic commission is to ensure people's health. The other thing is, and I don't think it would necessarily apply in an indie context, but if you think about the bigger promotions being able to take lead and kind of model what's acceptable in wrestling and what a crowd will want to see and will buy is, and I've said it a million times before, but this is where having some kind of union, professional association, whatever the heck you want to call it, to protect the wrestlers and, so that they don't have to go and take these potentially dangerous assignments for low pay where there isn't necessarily, appropriate medical supervision behind the scenes, that kind of thing.
Oh, don't let Money in the Pharaoh let you hear you say that. That'll put you on their absolute hit list.
You know
Monty
what?
and Apparel hate the
You know
idea
what?
of wrestlers
When
ever joining together.
when AEW first started, and Cody Rhodes was named as one of the EVPs, he was directly asked about the possibility of AEW talent being part of a union because Tony Khan's background coming from the NFL players have a very strong union. And I would argue that it's made an awful lot of people very wealthy, and notwithstanding some of the really awful dangers that come with a career in football, and the average lifespan of an NFL player is considerably shorter than general population, and the average NFL career is only about 3 years long. Compare this to like a Ric Flair who's wrestling for over 40 years, for example. But having that kind of safeguard, especially given what kind of big business AEW is, WWE is, I'm sure you could look at New Japan and some of the other promotions, but even just keeping to the US and Canada, I think that if there was more in place so that wrestlers didn't have to put their health and their lives in jeopardy, especially, as you get older, whether you're in great shape or not, injuries are more likely, recovery times take longer. We saw this with Adam Copeland. He comes back and immediately he's on the shelf for 9 months. CM Punk, who's also in his mid-40s, comes back and injures pretty much the same injury that Copeland had, and he's on the shelf for an extended period of time. Same with Christian Cage. Jericho in the last few years has had a couple of injuries that took a long time to heal. So whether they can keep going or not, part of the question is, do they have to keep going? And what can be done to make it a little bit easier if they decide to transition to something else so that it is more of a choice for them?
Well, I do want to mention that because you brought up the athletic commissions, and I can tell you this, and most people don't know this, but there's absolutely no bigger joke in the entire governmental system across the United States than the California Athletic Commission. Seriously, it's a joke. It is never, I've never seen them enforce anything.
Tennessee's is worse. Tennessee is one of the only states that would license Flair. I don't know if you remember former WCW commentator Chris Cruz, who's a bit of a gadfly on social media. He called it out right away when Flair announced his retirement match, that they deliberately chose a venue in a state where the athletic commission was not going to do any kind of serious investigation.
I would guess that maybe because that was a high profile match, but anything that's lower profile, I guarantee you in the 24 years that I've been involved in indie wrestling here in Northern California, I've never seen hide nor hair of any Fed that's been touched by the California Athletic Commission for any reason, ever. That they care about, high school football quite a bit. They will, regulate that, but they've never touched pro wrestling and probably never will, because it's just something that flies completely under their radar. So it's not going to get any regulation, any kind of medical testing is not going to come from the California Athletic Commission. I don't know about other states or Canada, but I can guarantee you it will not be in the focus of the state of California, nor will it ever.
So our laws in Ontario, anyway, are a little bit more robust. They used to be a lot more, but between the mid 80s, early 90s, they kind of ratcheted back like everywhere else did, once it was acknowledged that pro wrestling was a performance and not on the level, so to speak, as an athletic contest. We actually in Ontario used to have a law that in the context of a professional wrestling match, you could not have a woman in the ring at the same time as a man. Wow. So you think about going from that to, by the late 90s, when you had Chyna in the ring. And at that time, they toured a lot more frequently up here. Lita as well. Too. And by that point, that law had been taken off the books, again, because it was recognized that, guys aren't legitimately going to hurt women. But it was an interesting thing to see kind of how that evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. So, guys, so as we're kind of getting close to wrapping it up here, I wanted to get your thoughts of guys like uh, the two gentlemen uh, that Evan brought up today, and Tony Jones. Like the idea that you work this hard, but you don't get to the highest level. You only get to maybe touch that, a little bit. Like Tony Jones was able to have a couple of matches with the WWE, but nobody ever recognized him for that. People heard about him was because of his indie career.
And Beyond the Mat, people remember him because that was a successful film.
Correct. But again, it was a success, but his part in it wasn't because he was successful. It was actually because he didn't actually make the WWE, and they watched him, have his dreams basically get smashed in a cinematic level. And so, like, do you think that those individuals achieved enough in their careers to be satisfied, even though they didn't make it all the way to the WWE? I'm always going to look at, just for a second, I'm always going to look at what I've done as Buddy Sotelo as a complete success. The fact that I even got one chance to manage one match in one indie fed in front of, I don't care, even 5 people, to me, was like the greatest success that I've ever achieved in my life, other than having my twins and maybe, passing the California bar exam. Like, that's like the third most successful thing I've ever done in my life. And I still look at it as such. But do you think that those other guys got what they wanted out of their career?
I think it comes down to the individual and what their definition of success is. I once had a really ugly, heated debate with Dave Shearer. And he said, "You're not a success." Quote, "You're not a success because you never made a living in pro wrestling." And I would argue that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 1,000 years from now, people will turn on The Wrestler and there I'll be. And we created art with that film, not to sound pompous or arrogant, but it's a beautiful, heartfelt film, and it's as great a performance as you're ever going to see with Mickey Rourke. And, and I'm very proud of 350 Days, and I'm proud of whatever I've done in the wrestling business. So the fact that I've never gotten quote unquote rich from it, it's a whole different argument. If success is just based on money, then it depends how the individual looks at money and the definition of success. I could tell you that my friend Tiger Khan, the drugs, alcohol, and steroids that killed him at age 33, obviously he wasn't happy that he did not attain his dream of working for WWE. So, he wrestled all over the world. He wrestled regularly for the Hearts up in Calgary Stampede. He was respected by his peers. Everybody that knew him knew he was an excellent wrestler and clearly a pro. I saw him wrestle with WWE guys on indie shows, and he was absolutely capable. But for him, it wasn't a success, and ultimately the pain of it all killed him. So
yeah, it's the same story of Crash Holly. He wasn't really my friend, but I did know him. And it's the same kind of thing when you have that taste of success and then it's ripped away from you and you go back to just being a regular schmo. And I think that was one of the things that you touched on so perfectly in The Wrestler that really touched me deeply, was what happens when that fame goes away. Can you handle it? Most people can't. A lot of people can't.
I know WWE Hall of Famers who end up pushing a broom. They headline Madison Square Garden and arenas around the world. I know guys who ended up bouncing at strip clubs. and it's very humbling. It's devastating. You go from star to pick up the trash, and literally pick up the
Or
trash.
maybe nothing at all. Maybe you're sitting in a hotel room just waiting, flipping cards into a hat, waiting for somebody to call you and say for you to do the next show. You show up at tryouts, and they say, nice, but no cigar, and we're gonna go with person X or person Y, and you don't get a call back.
We're dying in a hotel room like so many of these guys have done because they're not happy with their Latin life after the glory. It's a brutal business. So is boxing. So is porn. So is anything where you're using your body to make a living. Plenty of broken down ex-NFL players, back in the day before they made money. Plenty of baseball players who never made any real money. When I was a kid, it was front page news when Tom Seaver made $100,000 for the Mets in New York. It was front page news. It was shocking. And people were jealous. They were jealous. Oh my God, he's making $100,000. And then Curt Flood opened up, pardon the pun, the floodgates when Curt Flood, fought for the players, and all of a sudden they were making better money.
Was it Willie Stargell or something like that, or Dave Stewart? I think got some kind of $1 million contract, and everybody went completely nuts on that. It
was front page when Seaver made $100,000. These guys had winter jobs in the off season. They lived in the neighborhood. They literally lived in the neighborhood back in the day. These weren't. I'm watching the Knick game the other day. I was a huge Knick fan back in the day, and they said that one of the players got a $50 million contract. So then you go, okay, well now I know why the nosebleed seats are $300+ for the first round of the playoff, because that's one guy making $50 million. So what can I say? Success to me is you're happy. You're happy with your lot in life. And as somebody older, I'm older than you guys. Let me just say this. What's really success? Surrounding yourself with mutually supportive friends and family who love and respect you, and you follow your muse, and you help people in some capacity. And you have some degree, it doesn't have to be religion, some degree of spirituality where you have some kind of peace of mind. And that's why I feel obligated to write pieces like I did on Tony Jones and Hector Bozer and Tom Parks, because the vast amount of quote unquote wrestling media are not going to do it. They're not going to do it. And, acknowledge people that have followed their muse, followed their path, attained whatever degree of success they feel is success, help people along the way. And, these guys deserve to be acknowledged and remembered and at least addressed. I get so upset when I watch a WWE show and a legend dies like Lanny Poffo, who was a dear friend, and he's not even mentioned. How disgraceful. 3 hours of a stultifying Raw, and you can't take 30 seconds to acknowledge somebody that generated money for you, that worked for you. Over the years, so many of their guys, they never even mentioned. They're just gone.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
I just wanted to add something to what Evan was saying, that, as important as it is to acknowledge and celebrate people after they passed, I tend to think it's even better to do it while they're still here.
Yeah.
If one has the opportunity to do so. And I think maybe that goes a little bit hand in hand with what you were saying about helping people. But I tend to think, I think we all have a tendency, especially those of us who kind of work in varying degrees, looking at stuff with a bit of a critical eye to point out all the stuff that we don't like. And there is plenty that we may not like. There are inequities. There are decisions that we would disagree with. But I think it's also incredibly important to call out the good wherever we find it. And if we have a chance to work with people who really are great, or we hear of the rare kind of good news stories of that, I think it's really important to amplify that, whatever kind of platform we may have, whether it's, podcasting or writing, or just even in the conversations that we have day to day, to point out, whether it's the people we follow for our hobbies or just the people we hang out with, to kind of call that out wherever possible. So to kind of go back to the question about, would you consider an indie wrestler a success? I think that you really have to ask the individual indie wrestler that. I mean, and I think that even if you, depending on who you ask, if they look at things with even a little bit of self-reflection, depending on how you mean it, you get a different answer. A little while ago, you had the former DC Drake on the podcast, and he really one of the unsung heroes of early what would become ECW.
He was great. I used to see him live. Tremendous.
And speaking as a kid when he was wrestling, one of the first kind of non-WWF, WCW guys to kind of pop up in the Bill Apter magazines and really kind of capture my attention and realize that wrestling was a lot more than just, whatever beamed into my living room once a week. But he has, looking back on it, a pretty complicated view of his time in wrestling. I think, he acknowledges that he had a chance to be in some very interesting rooms, that he accomplished a lot for the stage that he was on. I think that the fact that he never appeared for WWE or WWF or the NWA or anything like that was almost a mutual decision in his case. He had a lot going on in his life that kind of would have militated against that. And, he did, suffer a number of personal setbacks. He did raise his kids pretty much by himself. And I think for where he's at now, I get the feeling that he's a lot happier for being who he is, where he is, than he would have been if he just kind of hung on forever. And he did kind of try to make a few of those fan convention appearances or to get back into the ring long after his mainline career had ended. And by the time he did that, it just wasn't for him. And that's good. He got to a place where he seems, at least from, what little conversations I might have with him, to be happy and well adjusted and in a better place for being outside than he would have been had he stayed in. Contrast that with a guy, another wrestler who kind of pops up on my social media feed quite often is Bob Cook,
who cursed me on my page yesterday because I politely said to somebody, please, let's not bring up politics on my page.
And you know what, Bob, again, I don't know the dude personally. I've had a couple of interactions with him online, but here's somebody who, when he has an opportunity to post, he has a few themes that he hews pretty closely to, but the big one is that, he had this opportunity to wrestle. He worked in Florida. He trained under the great Malenko. He worked WCW. He fought Ric Flair on a match. He certainly did a lot more, albeit from an enhancement perspective, than a main event role, but he still sees that as the highlight of his life. And he's never found anything since then that makes him, gives him the same kind of pride or enjoyment as he did there. Not career, not family, not anything like that. And, if that's what he sees, that's fine. I hope he's fine. I hope he's happy in and of himself. But I got to tell you, if I had to pick between one way of looking at things between those two, I know where I'm looking.
There's a lot of wrestlers and people involved in the industry in general who have a love-hate relationship with all of it. And I understand that. There's enough dirtbag promoters. There's been enough backstabbing and everything else. But a guy like Tony Jones and Russell, aka Buddy, will tell you universally loved and respected. And that's something. That's really something that not everybody in any profession can say. A guy like Tony Jones was just utterly respected and loved. And the fact that he didn't get his big break, a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't, but you can't take it away from him. He followed his dream. He took it as far as he could, and he made a lot of friends.
Yeah, I know that Tony Jones was at peace with what he had accomplished, and that was one of the things.
There you
that
go.
was really great.
There you go.
Jonathan, I have a question for you, though. Do you feel your career in pro wrestling has been a success with what you've done? If everything ended today, which I hope it doesn't.
I hope not too. Look, I feel very lucky that I get to do what I do. I'm grateful that I have a platform. I've learned an incredible amount about writing and wrestling and all that from working with Greg. I learn something every time I get to go on this podcast.
You have? What have we done wrong?
No, I'm saying like I'm learning as we go. And again, I've had a chance to be in some rooms that I never thought that I would be in. But I got to tell you, I came into this into my 40s. I started doing it mainly because I've always wanted to write, and I figured, well, at some point I've got to put my money where my mouth is. Is there a lot more that I would love to do? Yeah. If Tony Khan wanted to call me or Paul Levesque wanted to call me and say, hey, we'd like you to join the writing staff, would I go? Heck yeah. Am I holding my breath for that? No. But if the opportunity arose, I would absolutely jump at it just to say that I had the chance to do it. If I had the chance to do it on an indie show, I would love to do it. I think, if I had a chance to work as a manager for an indie show, sure, why not?
I've done that. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I figure I've got kind of the evil lawyer Gary Hart, Kevin Sullivan, evil whack job thing going on.
You're always a heel. That I can attest for that. You can always be a heel if you show up as a lawyer
to be perfectly honest, I don't think that if I were to turn the volume up to 11, like everybody kind of says as part of the gig, I think it would be a heck of a lot easier to get people to boo me than it would be to cheer me. And I am good with that. But like really,
but everything else that you've
as much fun as I have doing this,
yeah,
and as much as I would love to be able to say I could take it farther, I passed the bar too. That was I am proud of that. I am proud that I get to have the letters JD after my name. I am more proud.
Juvenile delinquent. What's JD?
Juris Doctor.
Juris Doctorate.
Yeah. Oh, okay, just checking.
I'm proud of that. I am proud that I've been able to hold a steady job for the last 10 years. I am proud that I have been married for the last 10 years through thick and thin.
Yeah.
I am proud that I made 2 kids who are more awesome than I could ever have imagined, and that I get to be, pardon the pun, ringside as they grow up and become the people who they're going to be. And there is no professional wrestling script that I could write that will be more fascinating to me than seeing where these 2 kids end up. So, do I think I'm a success? To be perfectly honest, I don't think that book's written on me yet. And and to be really honest, I don't think that by the time that book is written, I'll be around to see how I'll be there to appreciate what the actual ending is. The ending is out of my hands.
Well, it's better than what's going to be said over at my funeral, which is "It's about time," or "What finally killed him." That's what mostly people are going to ask in my obituary or during my funeral service. But otherwise, there's a few people will be saying, "Good, it's about time."
But my favorite comment on that one is that I just hope my remains are scattered at Disney World, and I do not want to be cremated.
Can I just add something very quickly? There's a 50% divorce rate in America, approximately. There's a lot of messed up kids. The fact that Jonathan has a successful marriage, good kids, a good career, follows his muse, to me, you're checking all the boxes for success. And, the fact that Jonathan doesn't make $1 million in pro wrestling does not negate all the great things that he's doing. So, we got to get past everything being based on how much money you generate. It's
And the thing is, I would love the $1 million. Don't get me wrong. But if I had to choose between the $1 million and the people and the things and the fact that, among other things, I have a job that allows me the freedom to, certainly not during office hours, but I can work a full day, do something fulfilling, work in a career where I'm hopefully helping the people of Ontario, because I work for the government, and still be able to indulge this hobby the way that I do. I think there's value in that. I mean, there's value in time, and there's value in being able to have the time to connect to the people who matter to you.
You have balance. Most people don't.
And
guys, to be perfectly honest,
this is why this show is different than every other podcast about wrestling. Is what we just covered is something that people just don't talk about enough in situations like this. And I really want to thank you guys for being here tonight to talk about a subject like this that isn't just, something that's just on the surface. I just love it when we go deeper and talk about the whys of professional wrestling and not just the whats about professional wrestling. If you guys
thank you for doing 250 or so shows. How many is it now?
Well, I think we're at 216 now.
216. Okay, well you're getting there. 216 shows. And who else is doing a show that's covering Tony Jones and Hector Boza and Tom Parks and the subjects that we covered tonight? They're all obsessively talking about the bloodline for 10 years or whatnot. Come on. We're adults. We're not kids anymore. It's bigger than that. This is
why I look forward to doing the show every week for 216 weeks in a row, is because we talk about stuff like this. I look forward to it because it does something for me personally. And I couldn't do it if I was just doing it by myself. Having you guys here and sharing what you guys feel is important makes it important to me. And I want to thank you guys for that.
Thank you.
So, anyway, that's going to be it for the show this week. See everyone next week. Thanks for.
Can I plug something real quick?
Oh yes, please, guys, plug.
Yeah, please check out Evan Ginsberg's Old School Wrestling Memories. We update 15 to 20 times a day, and we have some really interesting threads in there. And I dig up a treasure trove of history. I posted something today I didn't even know about. Jerry Graham had an argument with Lou Thez before a match, and he said, "I'm going to shoot on you." And Lou Thez said, "Bring it," and he pinned him in under 1 minute.
Yeah.
Legit.
I've
never heard this story before, but when I was researching Tom Parks' life on this Arizona blog spot on pro wrestling, Dale Pierce wrote this piece, and Dale Pierce was a published author. He had dozens and dozens of books, a true historian. So I believe it, because Dale wasn't the kind of guy to make stuff up. So Evan Ginsberg's Old School Wrestling Memories on Facebook, and check out Wrestling Then and Now, the documentary. Yours truly, the senior editor of Pro Wrestling Stories, who also, JP Zarka, the editor, covers a lot of guys when they pass and acknowledges them as well. And 350 Days, of course, and etc. So on. We got some book projects this year.
Tolos stuff.
Yeah, John Tolos book with Dr. Mike Lano. I'm sure Mike will be back next week, and other projects. And it's a pleasure talking to two guys who have interest and a life outside of wrestling. Some of these guys don't.
Jonathan, your plugs this week?
So as usual, slamwrestling.net has all the latest news, and some pretty interesting opinion pieces are up as well. My most recent Wrestler's Court with Jonathan Schwartz came up last week. I actually looked after being pretty critical about wrestlers like Flair or Sting, who seem to go on long after their athletic primes. some examples of wrestlers who are kind of a little bit older and are putting on shows that you wouldn't believe, like Copeland and Christian and Jericho. I have another column coming up in the next week or so, basically looking at the potential emergence of a faction based around the Uncle Howdy character. How do you go on with something like that after the original star of the angle, Bray Wyatt, has passed on? And what are some of the other cases where that's happened, and is it something that could work, and is it something they should even try? I also may have a book review coming out for something really interesting, at least to me, coming out in the next week or so.
Hey, Jonathan, I have a real quick question for you, since you're the expert on this. So with a character like Bray Wyatt and the technology they have today with the AI and everything, couldn't WWE actually, he was a supernatural character to begin with. Couldn't they work a Bray Wyatt into an angle at this point?
Bray Wyatt Ghost.
I actually suspect that they might try something like that.
There you go.
I think that, Bray Wyatt, quote unquote, is their intellectual property. The Fiend is owned by WWE, along with whatever was coming, I presume, for this storyline. I could very well see them
during
trying
COVID.
to do
They did
like
do
that.
those theatrical, matches.
Yeah.
So it might be in the cards.
And I think that the audience would. I think if they wanted to do kind of either kind of like a Sister Abigail, completely fictional character who was never really realized, I think the audience might go for something like that. I think that if they wanted to do even just kind of a disembodied voice, kind of like if you remember the old WCW when they had Curtis Iaukea.
Oh, I was thinking the Black
playing that. I've got to tell you, the Curtis Iaukea, Sullivan, my son, like that whole deal, one of my all-time favorite silly wrestling angles. But if they wanted to do something like that, but make it spookier, I think they could get away with that. I think if they hew too closely to try and pretend as though Bray Wyatt in any of his incarnations is still around, I think that the audience would absolutely reject that, and I would agree with them. I think it's a really... The line that I want to use in the piece that I'm going to write about this is, if you remember Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, we're so focused on whether we can do it that we don't care about whether we should.
Interesting.
And I think that kind of would cross a line. And it's a line that WWE has crossed before, and it's not something I've ever been a fan of. I mean, for how many years have they tried to drag Eddie Guerrero's body through any number of angles after he passed away? And every time they do it, I just cringe. I mean, I'd like to think they learned from it, because they've toned it down, for example, with Brian Pillman Jr.
angle.
But
the King Necrophilia angle didn't quite work.
but that's fictional and stupid from day one. I draw the line between real people who actually have families. So for Eddie Guerrero, who at the time had young kids and a wife who had to figure out what her life was going to be like after this, regrettably, Bray Wyatt's very much a similar situation in terms of leaving a young partner and very young children behind. Brian Pillman was the same thing. They were just shameless about how they dealt with that at the time. But now that Pillman's adult son is involved, they've at least made some effort to distance him from the circumstances around his father's death.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting article. Definitely going to be a very interesting article. We got to go, guys. So we'll talk about it more, hopefully, in upcoming weeks when you have that released. And it's great to have you guys on the show again. We'll have you on again soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.